A young man named Frank attends a party. He notices a beautiful woman and decides to introduce himself. April asks Frank just one question. What interests you in life? She isn't interested in what Frank does for a living. She wants to know about his passions. 10 years pass. April is acting in a play, but she isn't doing well. Frank goes backstage to her dressing room to comfort her, but April becomes even angrier. On the way home, Frank tries to talk to April about the performance again, but she refuses to discuss it. Frank ignores her request and stops the car to have a conversation about the situation. Frank doesn't understand why she's so upset and tries to calm her down, but April asks him to leave her alone. She doesn't want to talk. She just wants to go home. They argue. April walks away from him, and Frank calls her crazy. He says he's not at fault and just wanted to talk. April accuses him of trapping her into doing things she doesn't want to do. April calls him a boy, which only fuels his anger. The next day, Frank heads to New York for work. April feels guilty for insulting him the night before. Frank hates his job and his boss. He recalls how his father worked at the same company his entire life and got nothing out of it. His boss scolds him again, but Frank tunes him out and walks away. He helps a woman with her work and invites her to dinner. Meanwhile, April remembers the day they moved into their house. At dinner, Frank jokes a lot, which pleases almost every woman he talks to. The next morning, Mrs. Helen, their neighbor, visits April. She brings potted plants but has another reason for coming. Helen tells April about her mentally ill son. She says he is entirely reasonable, but sometimes behaves strangely and cannot hide his feelings or emotions. She asks April and Frank to talk to him, as he really needs friends. April agrees to help. After Mrs. Helen leaves, April finds old photographs and remembers how happy she and Frank used to be. Frank talks about how much he enjoyed living in Paris and how his ultimate dream is to return there for good. He believes that people in Paris are free and can do whatever they want. April listens with admiration and dreams of one day visiting another place. Frank wakes up in a hotel with the woman he had dinner with. He kisses her goodbye and leaves. That evening, he comes home to find April waiting for him. She apologizes to him and says she loves him. Frank walks into the house and sees his children. Frank goes to take a shower, feeling terrible about what he's done. All day, April has been working on a plan. She proposes that Frank sell the house and move to Paris. At first, Frank thinks it's a joke, but April explains that this is their only chance to start a new life. She reminds Frank of the dream he abandoned because of his job. April convinces Frank that this is his opportunity to figure out what he truly wants to do with his life. After giving it some thought, Frank agrees with her plan. The next day, he goes to work and writes a new ad script, doing his job half-heartedly since he plans to quit soon. Frank tells his friends that he and his family will soon move to France for good. None of them believe it because the idea seems ridiculous to them. Frank enjoys the way his friends look at him and feels special. Frank and April decided to move to France in a few months, giving them time to prepare thoroughly. Their family life improves, and they become a happy couple. One day, they visit their neighbors. April mentions that they will soon leave the neighborhood for good. Shep and Millie don't understand their decision, but congratulate them on their upcoming move. The news upsets Shep the most, as he has feelings for April. Frank and April return home and laugh, enjoying people's reactions when they fail to understand them. Frank says he hasn't felt this alive in a long time. She kisses him, and things escalate between them right on the kitchen table. A week later, Frank goes to work and learns that the company director liked his latest ideas. The boss wants to promote him and offer a higher salary. Frank decides not to tell his boss yet that he plans to resign. The next day, Frank and April host guests. Mrs. Helen arrives with her husband and their son John, who has a mental illness. John immediately starts asking Frank questions about his life. John always says what's on his mind, and he finds their family intriguing. Frank shares that he plans to quit his job soon and that they will move to France as a family. During a walk in the woods, John says he respects their decision and believes they must be strong to make such a significant change in their lives. Frank and April realize that John is very intelligent, even if a bit unusual. After their guests leave, they feel inspired by his words. They seem as crazy as John, but they're ready to take the risk for their happiness. A few days later, Frank has dinner with the company director. He announces his intention to resign. The director asks him to reconsider. Frank starts to wonder if his true calling might actually be here, not in Paris. That evening, he meets his lover at the hotel again. One day, the two families go to the beach together. Frank reveals that he will soon be heading a new sales division. April is upset that he hasn't told her about this before and becomes angry. That evening, they argue, and April confesses that she is pregnant. Frank is furious about her decision and says they can't keep the child because of naive fantasies about their future in Paris. April responds that she has felt trapped for the past 10 years. Frank is shocked by her words. April concludes by saying that she loves their children. The argument escalates, and Frank declares that they will stay here and that he will work to provide for the family. From that point on, April no longer wants to spend time with Frank. She almost completely stops talking to him. One evening, she cheats on him with their neighbor, who is in love with her. A few days later, Frank decides to confess to April that he has been unfaithful, hoping to make her jealous. However, she realizes he is merely trying to manipulate her. April tells him she doesn't care what he does anymore. She admits that she doesn't love him anymore. Frank loses control and begins to get angry. Unexpectedly, John arrives with his parents. He learns that April is pregnant and that they've decided not to move to Paris. John laughs at them, calling them cowards. But soon he realizes that it was Frank who changed his mind and made the decision for his wife. John calls Frank a boy. Frank gets furious and tries to hit John but stops himself. John notices that April barely reacts and remarks that they deserve each other. Frank looks at April and realizes that she agrees with John's words. He starts raging and shouting. Frank loses control and begins smashing furniture. April thinks he's about to hit her. April runs into the woods and begs Frank not to follow her. She says she needs time to think. The next morning, Frank wakes up and finds April in the kitchen. She is acting strangely, pretending that everything is fine. April makes him a delicious breakfast and asks him about his new job. Frank eagerly talks about his responsibilities, and April realizes that this job is truly important to him. She feels happy for him and sees him off to work. April is left alone. She calls the nanny and asks her to take care of the kids until the evening. She cries and asks the nanny to kiss the children for her. April takes some pills and goes to the bathroom. Frank arrives at the hospital and tells Shep that April lost a lot of blood after doing this to herself. Shep steps away to get some coffee, and when he returns, he finds Frank overcome with grief. April has died. A few months later, Mrs. Helen sells their house to new owners. She calls them the best couple that has ever lived there. Her husband remembers her saying the same about Frank and April, but simply turns off his hearing aid to avoid listening to her words. Shep and Millie meet the new neighbors. Millie tells them about what happened to Frank and his family. Shep doesn't want to hear it or remember that day. He asks his wife never to speak of Frank and April again. After his wife's death, Frank moves to New York and dedicates his life to his children. He realizes that his family is far more important than his work.